Dr. Kelkar is chairman of and professor at the McDougall School of Petroleum Engineering at the University of Tulsa, where he's taught since 1983. Earned his bachelor's degree in chemical engineering at the University of Bombay, India in '79, master's degree in petroleum engineering, and his PhD in chemical engineering at the University of Pittsburgh, 1981 and 82, and earned his Juris Doctorate at the University of Tulsa in '89. Prolific researcher during his academic career, his areas of specialty are in reservoir characterization, production, optimization, risk analysis, scale-up, and design multi-phase reactors. He's a member of the American Institute of Chemical Engineers, the Society of Petroleum Engineers, the Society of Exploration Geophysicists, and the Oklahoma Bar Association. Dr. Kelkar has authored dozens of peer-reviewed articles, technical reports, and other publications, including several books. Today, he is here to share with us his view of and the outlook for the energy transition taking place today.
Thank you, Tony. Before I begin and I talk about energy transition, I want to start with this premise that all of you actually study science and math, and one of the prerequisites of science is that science is messy, and sometimes the conclusions we reach may not be the accurate conclusions. It happens. I mean, sometimes it does happen. But as scientists, we have to believe in science. We have to believe in refereed journals. We have to believe in publications, because that's the current understanding of our science. So if you deny science and then I talk about some other subject which relates to science, you won't believe me, okay? So what I want to start with is a premise that climate change is real, okay? And over the last 150 years, 1 degree, 1.1 degree to be exact, the temperature has risen by about 1.1 degrees. So I'm going to start with that premise, okay? So it is not an argument about denying science. Instead, I want to give you some historical perspective about energy transition and tell you what type of role petroleum engineering will play in the future, okay? So that's the overall topic of the discussion. So what does it mean, energy transition? I think a lot of people have different meanings, but I want to talk about that a little bit more. I want to relate energy to prosperity, because if you look at the consumption of energy today in the world, you'll find that energy is the biggest currency. Every time you purchase something, you are purchasing energy, because energy brings convenience to our life. And more convenient is our life, more energy we consume, okay? Fossil fuels, of course, why are they important? And I do want to look at the past to say something about the future. And then what is the role of petroleum industry in the future, and then role of petroleum engineering in the energy transition. So energy transition can be defined in many different ways. I mean, if you look at animate energy to inanimate energy, if you go back 10,000 years, human energy was the only energy which was available to us. Then we trained animals, and the animals started providing with some energy source. So essentially, we started with animals, and then ultimately we went to inanimate energy, which is mostly fossil fuels, and that's one of the energy transitions you can think about. You can also talk about one type of energy source to another type of energy sources. That means we convert heat energy to electricity. So there is also that type of energy transition which is possible. Fossil fuel to other type of energy. So for example, sometimes you can convert coal into liquids. We did that in 1940s and in the Second World War. So this is another energy transition which is possible. And then one type of prime mover to another type of prime mover. So we started with steam engines. Now we use turbines. So it's also another way more efficiently transferring the energy. So when we define energy transition, it can be all kinds of transitions we can think about. But I just want to talk about basically the energy transition how we conventionally define, which is simply instead of using one type of energy source, we are trying to use some other type of energy source. So let's look at the history a little bit. About 5,000 years ago, we of course started using animals. And We also use wind and water. I think people talk about wind and water as something new, but we have been using that for almost 2,000 years. So animals, of course, were much more efficient because an average human can create about 700 kilocalories worth of work, okay? Compared to that, horses, donkeys, buffaloes, they generated a little bit more, so we started using the animals. But in general, when you look at our energy input versus energy output, only about 12 to 16% of the energy input we have, we can convert that into useful work. So if we eat food, doesn't mean we can convert all of that in useful work. Only portion of that gets converted. So it's about 15 to 16%. Of course, we use water mills in the past, and they did the work about 40 to 70 humans. And it's a convenient way to grind, cut, and things like that. Then, of course, we also use windmills about 1,000 years ago. And today's windmills are, of course, different than what the picture shows here, but they also did about 40 to 100 humans worth of work, okay? Now, right around 1700, we started using coal. So that's our energy transition to fossil fuels. And what was advantageous about fossil fuels is that it actually had tremendous amount of energy in unit of pound or unit of kilogram compared to anything else we have seen. So 1 pound of coal is about 3-inch cube. But if you look at the amount of kilocalories of useful work it can do, you can see that significantly more work can be done with 1 pound of oil, 1 pound of oil, 1 pound of gas compared to humans. So essentially, once we started using fossil fuels, we realized that we can generate a lot of energy, okay, compared to what we had available before, which was humans and animals. And not only that, what is interesting is that an average human exhales about 2.2 pounds of CO2 every day. So when you look at, and then they do about 700 kilocalories worth of work. If your human is working every day, physical work, at the most they can generate about 700 kilocalories, but they generate more CO2 than either coal, oil, or gas. For the same amount of output, same amount of work, they generate less CO2 than humans. So if you use humans today to do the same amount of work, we will generate a whole lot more CO2 than when we use fossil fuels. Of course, steam engines were introduced in 1730 by James Watt. In England, that was the first country which really started, you talk about industrial revolution, we started converting coal into steam. People suddenly realized that heat can be converted to motion. And that was a big deal that time. And of course, since that time, we started significantly increasing our consumption of fossil fuel. And here is what the consumption looks like today. So if you go back to 1800, which is right here, most of our energy came from biomass, okay, which is plants, trees. And then we started using coal. And you can see how the consumption has gradually increased. This is the terawatt hour. This is the amount of energy we created. But just to give you a perspective on this, right now the population of the world is about 8 billion. Okay, and 1 terawatt energy is 1.22 billion human days. So if every person in the world today works every day for 8 hours, we are able to generate about 7 terawatt hours. That's it. And if you look at what the scale is, it's 200,000. Okay, so the amount of energy we consume today can never be generated by humans. Okay, obviously. And most of that energy is coming from coal, oil, and gas. So if this is coal, this is oil, and this is gas. So if you look at about 80% energy today comes from those 3 resources. And if you look at the percentage, you can see, again, biomass is about 10%, less than that, about 5%. Oil, coal, gas mostly occupy most of it. Nuclear is tiny. Hydro is a little bit. Solar and wind is about 3% today. So when you look at the overall energy consumption and how much renewables contribute, it's a very tiny percentage of the energy consumption today. Most of it's coming from oil, gas, and coal. What is interesting about fossil fuel consumption is that you go back to percentage of energy which is provided by fossil fuels going back to 1750, and again starting 1800 we started using coal. Over the last 50 years, okay, since starting in 1970, 80% of the energy has been provided by fossil fuels. Last 50 years, it has remained fairly constant. So although we talk about solar and wind and how much they are contributing, our overall energy consumption in the world is increasing so fast that fossil fuel consumption has not changed. Percentage has remained fairly constant over the last 50 years. Okay? And the consumption of energy is required for human prosperity. So here's an interesting plot. You look at the population of the entire world over the last 10,000 years, and you'll be surprised to know that the population rarely increased, except in last 150 years. When we started using fossil fuels, our population also grew. It's like deer have a lot of food and the population of deer goes up. It's exactly like that for humans as well. Because look at that sharp increase in the population over the last 150 years. About 50 years ago, in 1970, population of the earth was 3.4 billion. Today is doubled, almost 8 billion. Okay? That type of rapid increase happened because we had abundant energy source available. There's a clear relationship between the population growth and the energy consumption. So if you think about reducing the energy consumption, think about its consequences. Not only that, and again, this is the same graph in different plot. You can let the population on y-axis and the fossil fuel consumption on x-axis. There's almost a linear relationship between the two, because without that energy source, without that consumption, we would not increase the population as we have increased in the past. But it's not only that. Even though our population has increased significantly, we have increased the prosperity of people as well. So if you look at what we have on the y-axis here is the GDP per capita. That means how much we are producing per person. So again, this is divided, normalized by population. The GDP per capita has increased 2.5-fold since 1970. So we have become richer 250% compared to just 50 years ago. An average person is more prosperous today. Even though the population has increased so much, we are actually more prosperous today than what we were 50 years ago. And there is a clear relationship between what UN calls as some type of human development index. And human development index is basically some kind of combination of GDP, ability to educate yourself, access to health care, so the empowerment of women. So a lot of these different combinations defines actually the human development index, and that's on y-axis, and the fossil fuel consumption is on x-axis. And what you see is a very clear relationship between human development index and fossil fuel consumption. So more fossil fuel we consume, which means, of course, more energy we use, better is the human development index. This is a very interesting graph. You can look at the percentage of the people who are poor, and the definition of poverty by United Nations is you make less than $4 a day. So it's not really a high bar to cross, okay? And using that definition, making $4 a day, if you go back and look at 1800, 90% of the world's population was poor, okay? You look at today, less than 10%. It's almost close to about 2 or 3%. So the poverty has declined significantly in the world as we reach 80% of the fossil fuel consumption. So if you look at this, fossil fuel consumption has remained fairly constant at 80%, and the poverty has declined from about 70% to practically nothing. So when we use more energy, we consume more energy, and the energy is accessible to us, the poverty also in the world has declined. So why do we use fossil fuels? Okay? Why not use other energy sources which are available? And there are 4 important reasons. Okay? So when you think about 4 pillars of civilization, and when I ask the question, what do you think are the 4 pillars of civilization? Most people say iPhone. No, that's not the answer. The 4 pillars of civilization are cement, concrete, fertilizer, and plastics. Without those 4 things, you cannot live. Look around you, and you will find that without those 4 things, you cannot survive. Because all the buildings are constructed using cement and concrete. Plastic is everywhere. I mean, what are you sitting on? Around you, it's plastic. Your clothes, plastic, okay, some kind of plastic. And then fertilizer, of course, we require fertilizer to grow food. And without that, so basically there are 4 things which are important, which are provided by fossil fuels. One is abundant. We have a lot of it available. It's reliable. That means you can access to it when you want it. They provide 4 pillars of civilization. Today, there is no current technology which is available to produce steel, cement, fertilizer, or plastic except fossil fuels. We have no current technology which can produce those 4 things. Okay? And then it has a smaller footprint. So let me just go through this very quickly. How we are doing on time? Okay, all right. So this is a very important graph because it shows you reserves to production. What that means is that if I look at the current consumption of fossil fuel and look at the future, how many years of supply we have. And this calculation is done every year. And if you look at the oil, gas, and coal, which are the 3 important sources of fossil fuel, you can see that the ratio has remained fairly constant at about 50. You said this is 50. That means if you go back 1980, almost 43 years, that number is 50. So even in 1980, based on the current consumption, it was 50. Today, it's also 50. So although we are consuming tremendous amount of fossil fuel, we have enough for the next 50 years. Now, I don't want to say it's infinite. It's not. But based on the current needs, we have many years of fossil fuel left we can use to consume and generate enough energy. Remember, the need for fossil fuel has increased over the last 50 years. In 1980, we consumed about 50 million barrels of oil per day. Today, we consume 102 million barrels. So we have doubled our oil consumption in the last 50 years. And still, we have 50 years of supply. For oil, gas, as well as coal is even higher, about 140. And we can store it very easily. So if you look at the United States, we have about 3 to 4 months of storage. So tomorrow, we just stop producing coal, we will be able to generate energy. Same thing with oil storage. I mean, you know where most of the oil is stored. It's in Oklahoma, in Cushing. And if you look at the amount of oil which is stored, we have about 40 days of supply. Okay, we look at natural gas, we normally store it underground, we have about 60 days of supply. So not unlike solar and wind, which cannot be stored very easily because battery technology is not there yet, we have sufficient supply of energy which we can utilize in the case of emergency. So we have storage for oil, gas, and water. We can transport it very easily because we have the existing infrastructure of pipelines and trains and so forth. Now, look at the battery technology today, and I'm using the best possible technology which Tesla has what we call as a different types of ways by which you can store the battery, and the volume of this is about 4.7 feet cube. It has a capacity about 48.6 megajoules, and the cost is about $10,500. Okay, and this is what they call as mega pack, which has about 828 feet cube volume, storage capacity about 10,800 megajoules, and the cost is about $1.2 million. Okay? Now look at the storage per unit weight. Amount of millijoules per kilogram we can store in coal, oil, natural gas, and then Powerwall and Megapack. You can barely see those two, okay? Energy cannot be stored as efficiently in the battery technology today as we can store in coal, oil, and gas. It's much more efficient to store energy. A humble 1,500 barrel tank, which you see everywhere in Oklahoma, can store as much oil, as much energy, as about 10,000 battery packs, which are supplied by Tesla. Okay? So we are able to store much more energy in fossil fuels. And this is just a graph of dollar of storage. How much does it cost to store compared to how much does it cost to store 1 barrel of barrel? So if I just compare the technology in terms of same amount of energy, if you store it in oil in a typical tank compared to store the same amount of energy either using battery technology or something else, you look at the numbers. The cost in battery storage is about more than 10,000. So it's very expensive to store energy in battery. That doesn't mean the technology will not improve. Of course it's possible that technology can improve and we will reduce the cost. But this is today. Now another interesting thing which has happened in the world today is that as the farming has become much more efficient and mechanized, people are moving to cities. And by the way, this transition is happening everywhere in the world, not just United States, everywhere. So when you look at what percentage of the people are living in cities, you notice that in United States it's about 83%. In Africa it was 14%, now it's 43%. Asia is about 51%. So every place, people are moving to the cities. And when people move to cities, what you need is an energy source which is right next to the population. Okay? And if you look at building a power plant right next to the city, if you use coal, if you use oil, if you use natural gas, if you use nuclear, it's possible. You can build a power plant right next to it. But it's not possible with wind and solar because wind doesn't necessarily blow next to the cities. You have to transmit that energy somehow to these major cities. Okay? I already mentioned about steel consumption. You look at the amount of steel we are consuming. China hardly consumed any steel in 1960s, and it's one of the biggest consumers of steel. And the overall steel production is increasing in the world. Okay? The cement consumption increasing very fast. Right now, if you look at the construction in India, for example, India is consuming more steel, more cement than even China. But about 10 years ago, China was consuming the most cement and electricity. So essentially, you can see the consumption of these necessities is going to continue to increase in the future. Plastics, floor, I mean, you can think about plastic, medical, I mean, you look at everywhere, medical, use of plastic is ubiquitous. And the amount of tons of plastic we are using today is about 400 million tons compared to what we are doing in the past. Fertilizer, okay? So you look at phosphate, potash, nitrogen fertilizer. Nitrogen fertilizer comes from natural gas. And you look at the overall consumption of fertilizer, we require about 6 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. We convert that to fertilizer. And without fertilizer, we cannot grow. If you look at the cereal yield, which is on the y-axis, and fertilizer use, the countries which use more fertilizer produce more. As a matter of fact, this is again from United Nations, 50% of the population in the world will not survive if you don't use nitrogen-based fertilizer. We need fertilizer to create that kind of crop yield. I don't know how many of you have read a story about Sri Lanka that happened a few years ago when the new president came and he said that we are no longer going to use fertilizers. It's all organic, easier to say. But in practice, what happened is Sri Lanka went to bankrupt, became a bankrupt country. And their growth, mostly their exports, which were rice and coffee, they all went down. And the president was kicked out of the presidential palace. Literally. It was a revolution in the country. And that's because the yield just went down with using organic farming. Without fertilizer, it's not possible to grow as much, and we will not be able to support the population we have in the world today. And that the only way we can create that fertilizer is using natural gas. And of course, when you look at the modern development of hydrocarbons, we are producing these using very little footprint. I mean, if you drive around in Oklahoma today, most of the wells which are drilled are horizontal, so the footprint on the surface is very small. Now, wind farms take up a lot of space, okay, on the surface, and that is also true with solar panels, okay? So tremendous surface use because the energy is dispersed, and if you want to collect that energy, it requires a lot of surface area, okay? Again, this is power density compared to power density of gas, okay? So this is basically how much surface area is utilized to produce certain amount of power. And if you look at wind farm and solar farm based on the current technology, it's about 100 to 10,000 times more. Because oil is produced all over from underground, but the surface facilities are very small. So the surface footprint is small, although we are depleting oil and gas from large amount of resources, okay? So what I want to say is that we always are transitioning in energy. We've started with coal, we went to oil, we go to natural gas, and perhaps some other source will emerge in the future, and we will transition to that. But what is important to understand, and why the energy transition we talk today is so dangerous, is because in the past, energy transitions were always additive. That means we were using coal, we continued to use coal, and then we added oil. We added oil plus coal plus natural gas. We didn't substitute. Today we are talking about substituting one type of energy source to another type of energy source. We are not talking about adding. And with the current energy consumption, it is very difficult to substitute an energy source without this. So if you look at this graph, it shows if you have a 5% of the energy source, we started with 5%, what is the percentage of the energy which is provided by one particular source? And we have four graphs, coal, oil, natural gas, and renewables. And this is when we started having 5% of the energy provided by that source and the number of years after that. And you can see how slow that energy transition is. That coal reached its peak after 70 years, after it reached 5%. Oil reached its peak about 50 years after it started with 5%. Renewables started 5%, today it's about 10%, and that's after 60 years. So when we think about just taking this to 100%, in 30 years, you can see how difficult it is. So these are future projections. I can assure you that by 2050, we will not reach zero CO2 emission, okay? Except politicians, no one is predicting that. If you look at IEA, which is International Energy Administration, these are their projections. And if you look at 2050, you can very clearly see that natural gas is increasing, liquids, coal, here, and then renewables are, of course, more than what we started with, but still they contribute only about, say, 12, 13%. Okay? And natural gas, liquid, and coal combined still about 70%. So this is 30 years from now. So again, some observation that energy transition is very difficult. The substitution takes a long time because it takes tremendous amount of infrastructure. Okay? And fossil fuels have been providing about 80% of the energy. It has not changed much in the next 50 years. I want to represent petroleum industry, but not, and I want to make this point very clearly. It doesn't mean that climate change is real, as I mentioned to you beginning. So we don't want to dispute that. The question is, when we use fossil fuels, we have to say what are the costs associated with it and what are the benefits associated with it. Because life is all about making the decisions based on what are the benefits and what are the costs. And I believe that fossil fuels provide more benefits today than the costs associated with it, including the temperature change. Because there are about 2 billion people in the world today who have no reliable source of electricity. And it is hypocritical for a developing country to know that they cannot produce electricity with coal or some other source of energy when the developed countries have already developed those resources, have consumed tremendous amount of fossil fuel, and then you go to Africa and tell those people, I'm sorry, you cannot build a coal-fired power plant. Or you go to China or you go to India and you say, I'm sorry, you just have to stop consuming fossil fuels because we have a temperature change. So it's going to happen because self-interest prevails in the world. And most of the countries are more concerned about development of their own people than the temperature change. And so whatever you say, the fossil fuel consumption is going to continue to increase in the future because there are a large number of people in this world who require energy. And the only way they can get reliable source of energy is through fossil fuels. Because we don't have a technology today which can substitute that resource with anything else. Okay? So, yes, we have to accept the fact that the temperature might rise, but human ingenuity ultimately can solve that problem. I believe in your ability to solve the problems in the future. We will figure it out. I'm absolutely certain that we'll figure out if there's a temperature change, how we can fix that problem. So petroleum industry is great. I mean, it is global. If you're interested in traveling everywhere, you can do that because oil is produced everywhere. Good life balance, flexibility, a lot of good benefits. And petroleum engineers, I think you probably know that, but they get paid the best salary. I mean, our average engineers are making $110,000 starting salary. There are not many disciplines where after 4 years of college you make that money. Now, I'm not saying you should choose it because the salary, but at least you're well compensated if you decide to choose it. And a lot of individual responsibilities. Very young age, you will find that you will be responsible for a lot of decision making. So if you're a person who is self-motivated, wants to do some decision making by themselves at a very young age, I think this industry provides you with those opportunities. It's fairly safe compared to most other industries. So if you look at the occupational injury, you'll find that petroleum is quite low compared to many other disciplines. And more important than anything else, petroleum engineers can make a difference even in climate change. Because a lot of the solutions we are thinking about to prevent climate change deal with subsurface. And petroleum engineers can deal with that because we deal with nature, we understand subsurface, we understand uncertainties, so we can understand how much fluid can be injected, how much it can be produced, and all those basic ideas can be applied to CO2 sequestration. So if we decide that large-scale CO2 sequestration is required to minimize the effect on the climate, we are the ones who can solve that problem because we understand how to inject CO2 in the ground. So this is one possibility. We can also deal with methane emissions, which are quite problematic because of the temperature change. And we can deal with hydrogen economy if indeed hydrogen becomes a substitute and we can convert, say, water into hydrogen and use hydrogen as a economy. We know how to transport it. We know how to store it because we'll have to store it underground. Okay. Yeah, I think that's it. Geothermal, another big source of energy where, the Earth's crust is very warm and you can circulate water through it. Right now, the technology is expensive, but a lot of new advances are happening. And again, drilling a well, producing from geothermal. Again, this is a domain of petroleum engineering. So a lot of other areas which are related to climate change. I think petroleum engineers will work on those areas as well. So here's the conclusion. The fossil fuels are here to stay for many decades. I don't think we're going to get rid of them. And it's not because I work in petroleum industry, but it's the reality. Because last 50 years, what they have shown us, that people are becoming prosperous worldwide. And they become prosperous, they use more fossil fuel. And you can't really stop them from using it. And other energy sources will become additive. Solar will become more efficient. Wind will become more efficient, for sure. And they will definitely contribute to our energy sources, but they will become additive, not substitutive. Okay? And role of petroleum engineers will be important in both producing traditional energy sources as well as renewable sources. So, in case you want more information, here's my phone number and here's my email. Contact me anytime and I'll be happy to take you on a tour at the University of Tulsa. Thank you so much for listening. Really, I'll be happy to answer a few questions. So I think nuclear is a great choice, honestly. And nuclear power is really, if you really want to reduce CO2 emission, nuclear is the only solution, okay? And unfortunately, nuclear is expensive, but we can reduce the cost if we can standardize the reactors and make them possible. I mean, it's possible. We can make it smaller enough that they become modular. So nuclear reactor is a great choice, I think. But people who oppose fossil fuels, they oppose nuclear even more, and partly because of the fear that it can be not necessarily used for peaceful purposes, because it does generate plutonium, which can be used for nuclear bomb. But if you protect it, save it correctly, I think nuclear is really great choice. Absolutely, yeah.
Do you think it would cause any interference with the burning or use of natural fossil fuels?
No, I mean, it will not create that kind of problem. I think fossil fuel, we can burn them safely, obviously. So heating the earth will not result in that. But obviously, we talk about, I mean, the two important byproducts of temperature increase. One is the sea rise, sea level rise, obviously. And the second one is because places get heated unevenly, right? In the world, the temperature rise is not uniform. There are places which are going to be overheated. There are places which are not going to be as overheated. So, of course, people have to be protected. So, essentially, those are the two byproducts, important costs of temperature rise. And what I'm saying is that I'm not saying those are not problems, but I'm saying that we will be able to figure out the solution. And the reason I say that is because when we look at anything, we always look at cost benefit. And if people, an average person, not you, but somebody in the world who's living much more poorer than you are, if they believe that the benefits of using fossil fuel exceed the cost, they're going to continue to use the fossil fuels, and you will not be able to stop them. So we have to accept the fact that the fossil fuel consumption is going to continue to increase because there is a very large population in the world who does not have any reliable source of energy today. 2 billion people have enough energy source, but that leaves us about 6 billion people who have either limited source or no resource. And those people want to become rich. If you ask an average African, hey, you are really helping climate change because you're not consuming your energy. You want to be like this, or you want to be like somebody in America? What do you think the answer is going to be? So it's just a fact. So let me ask.
My question was, there's a lot more investment nowadays from organizations and wealthy individuals and even governments in renewable energy, do you think that increased investment in these newer forms of energy will affect oil industry negatively or no?
I think that in general, the percentage of the fossil fuel will decline over time. I mean, what you just said, which is wind and solar, they definitely are becoming better. I mean, they're becoming more efficient. They are going to contribute bigger percentage of the energy source. Absolutely. What I'm saying is that simply that energy transition is a slow process, and it will take many more years than what people want to believe in. So yes, the investment in solar, investment in wind is definitely going to increase the percentage which is contributed by those energy sources.
Do you think investment in wind energy resources is a more functional use of research money than maybe researching a regulated way of enforcing nuclear energy?
I don't know the answer to that question. I mean, it's a regulatory issue, really. I don't know. But I think we are wasting, I mean, I think that we had used wind before. Okay, so here's the problem with wind, that we used wind before 5,000 years ago, and we replaced that with fossil fuel. Why? Because wind was intermittent. It didn't give you the energy when you needed it. Nuclear can provide you with energy all the time when you need it. That's the benefit. That's the benefit of fossil fuels. It's a reliable source of energy. Wind is not, solar is not. And so it's kind of unfortunate that we are not spending a lot of money in the nuclear technology where we can really reduce CO2 emission. Instead, we spend money. I mean, you look at the offshore winds in New York and places like that, they are struggling. And what they're doing is they're going to utility companies and saying, we need to charge more because it's going to cost a lot more to build those wind turbines than what we expected. And most of the utility companies are saying, no. You look at Germany, Germany pays 3 times more in electricity than the US.
Isn't it because they like, if there's shipped in sort of like, not really shipped in, but they buy it from
Soviet Union? US? I mean, Russia? Germany generated a lot of energy, electricity from solar and wind. And they are paying for that because average citizen is paying 3 times more for electricity. Sorry. I think carbon sequestration is really important, but I tell you the problem with carbon sequestration. If you really want to do research, this is where an important area, because you know what happened in Oklahoma 10 years ago when we started injecting a lot of water in the subsurface that created earthquakes. And if you don't think that CO2 injection is also going to create those problems, okay, induce seismicity. And if we can figure out a way by which injecting CO2 safely without creating seismicity, that's a huge contribution. Geothermal resource, huge, unlimited, but very expensive. If we can figure out a way to drill the wells inexpensively in those formations, which are 400 degrees Celsius in temperature, so very high temperature, different metallurgy. You need to figure out a way by which you can drill those wells. That's a geothermal application. Building dikes, because if the water level rises in places, how do you figure out most inexpensive way of building the dikes so that people can be protected? Bangladesh is a good example, you know, where there is a rivers and it's going to flood if the water level rises. So people need to figure out how to build those dikes so that people can live safely. There are a lot of different areas. Hydrogen economy. If you transport hydrogen in a pipe, you know, hydrogen is such a small molecule, it diffuses through steel. So how do you build different type of materials so that we can transport hydrogen cheaply and safely? So a lot of different areas. And I know that you guys can come up with new innovations. That's what you have to do. I mean, I believe in human ingenuity. I believe in you guys to figure out a solution which is going to help us. All right. Thank you. Yeah.